Our next speaker is Dr. Prabhu Pingali. Dr. Pingali is the founding director of TCI and professor of applied economics at Cornell University. Previously, Professor Pingali was the Deputy Director of Agriculture Development Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from 2008 to 2013. So was elected to the US National Academy of Sciences as the Foreign Fellow in 2007, and he has also served as the President of International Association of Agriculture Economists from 2003 to 2006. Today, sir will be talking about food systems in Orissa.
First of all, I'd like to thank Father Augustine and Dean Misha. I just realized that I have a personal connection to Father Augustine. It turns out that he was the colleague of my brother, Professor Venugopal, when he worked at XLRI in Jamshedpur. So they were both deans at the same time in XLRI. So I felt that that's a good way to connect up to this meeting and a good welcome from XIM Bhubaneswar. I had a chance to give a talk at the Rural Management Center earlier this year, and I was really impressed by the faculty and the students in the Rural Management Center. And I look forward to building a stronger connection between Cornell and your center as we go ahead. Also want to recognize that our partners from the TARINA program are all here, and you'll be hearing from them today. We've got Santam Kumar from CARE, and Girish Soni from VIVE, and Amitabh Mishra from GDS. Just think about the fact that in the 60s we were talking about actual food shortages and high levels of hunger. And we've made great progress in addressing the problem of hunger and addressing the problem of calorie food shortage. And so I think in terms of what we have done relative to where we were in the 60s, we should all be very proud of the way we as a nation managed to address the problem of hunger. This doesn't mean that hunger has completely disappeared, but it certainly means that imagine what kind of situation we'd have been in if we did not address the problem through better technology, better infrastructure investments, and better policy change that we had throughout these decades. But now I think we're at the next point of needing a greater change as we look ahead in terms of food systems. And we're facing some big challenges for food systems in India. First, as we all know, diets are changing, and diet diversity is increasing quite dramatically. But at the same time, the ability for us to access more nutritious food, fresh vegetables, fruit, etc., is very limited because markets haven't responded as well to this changing need. And that's something we need to be thinking about. Even today's paper talked about tomatoes being 100 rupees per kg and other vegetable prices being very high. And as you think to the future, we need to think about a more increased supply and a stable supply that will allow us to have much more stable prices in the system. And the second issue is really that we've seen significant improvements in overall nutrition, but malnutrition levels continue to be very high in terms of stunting, wasting, underweight, etc. And one of the ways we need to address that problem is through more nutritious food. And we need to think about how one can look at diversity in food systems in having a direct impact on nutrition outcomes. And that's something that I'll keep talking about as we proceed. I think the third big challenge we have is, although for the poor, calorie-based diets are becoming cheaper and more affordable, more nutritious diets are definitely not affordable. And as we think about meeting the needs of the poor, our priorities ought to be to see how we can make more nutritious diets affordable. And this would include pulses, this would include livestock products, It would include fresh fruit, vegetables, etc. And the last area that I think I'd like to dwell on, just touch on it briefly, is the entire safety net programs that we have in the country. We've got an enormous program in the PDS, the midday meal schemes, and the Anganwadi systems, etc. And how one can look at these programs from a nutrition lens, rather than looking at them as we have traditionally done, looking at it from a hunger and calorie sufficiency lens for this program. So let me quickly go through and show you some data. I think one of the things that is most impressive when you think about India over the decades is the rate at which we've seen poverty declining. Of course, as Indians, we continue to be concerned about high levels of poverty. And that's the way we ought to be. But imagine that in the early 1970s, we were talking about poverty levels which were over 50% in the country. And today we're looking at poverty levels which are under 25%. So there's been a significant gain in overall poverty reduction. And even though one continues to see high levels of poverty. So one needs to look at the big contribution that the reduction in poverty has made in terms of income growth and in terms of rising demand for food and other products that we see in this country. It may be hard to see this graph here, but it shows that that overall poverty reduction issue has cut across states. And what's striking about this graph is some of the states that we think of as Bimaru states are also states where over time you've seen significant drop in poverty, although with poverty levels continuing to be high. So if you think about Orissa, and Orissa is here, the fourth state, and you look at Orissa and you see that in the early 1980s, the headcount ratio for poverty was around 65%. Okay? And the latest numbers, which 2011, 2012 numbers, show that the headcount ratio has dropped to 30%. So there's been a 50% drop in poverty using the headcount ratio measure. And we can argue whether that's good or not. But even just using that measure, there's been a 50% drop in poverty. Similarly, you've seen a drop in Bihar in poverty. So we see over time a tremendous change that's happening, and that change gets reflected in the food systems. The change gets reflected in the food systems primarily in terms of increased demand for diversity. So you see the change in terms of increased demand for protein-rich food, for livestock products, fresh fruits, vegetables, etc. You see this kind of a change happening, not just in India, but you see it happening dramatically in terms of the overall demand. And therefore, over time, you see that the relative prices of non-stable grains, relative to stable grains, keeps rising. And prices of vegetables, prices of fruit, livestock products, etc., continue rising quite dramatically. And that's because the market hasn't responded as much to this changing demand as it ought to. Now, we should also be very clear that this increased demand for diversity is happening across all income levels. If you look at the NSSO data on food expenditures, you see at a per capita level, per capita consumption of grain has been dropping across all income groups, except for the very lowest income group. Now, what's happening as that per capita consumption of calories from grain is dropping is that you're beginning to see consumers adding other food groups to the diet. Unfortunately, our data systems are not good enough to be able to capture the change in other food systems. And so the data on the drop in per capita consumption of staple grains is being misinterpreted, in my view, as a drop in overall calorie consumption of the population. But in my view, what's really happening is that diversity of diets is not captured in the current data systems in the country. And I can spend hours talking about this, but I won't. We can talk about that during coffee break. Let's look at the nutrition challenges. When you think about the nutrition challenges, child stunting is still a very big challenge, a big nutrition outcome that we face, a negative nutrition outcome that we face. But what's interesting is that the sort of over 50% of the population being stunted, children over 50, for districts where more than 50% of the children are being stunted, that number has come down significantly in many parts of the country. So many parts of the country, you're now looking at numbers which are closer to 20-30% of children who are in the stunted level. And what's interesting here is I've tried to separate out Orissa from the rest of the country to give you a perspective on what's happening in Orissa. And what's happening in Orissa is really quite interesting, because if you think about the state of districts such as Koraput or Kandhamal and Kalahandi, etc., these states are now becoming outliers in terms of nutrition outcomes relative to the more coastal, more well-connected districts around Bhubaneswar and up the coast, etc. And so even within the state, you begin to see this differentiation in terms of nutrition, in terms of poverty, rural poverty, etc. And from a priority setting point of view, we probably need to be much more targeted around these districts relative to other parts of the state. Similar story when you think about child underweight. Again, the child underweight figures as you go away from the coast, especially as you go towards the western parts of the state, like the southwestern parts of the state, you see much higher nutrition, negative nutrition outcomes relative to the other parts of the state, and require more attention. Now here's another point that I want to bring up, because I don't think this gets into the Indian discussion as much as it ought to. And that is, I have a figure here where you can look at, on the x-axis, the percentage of underweight children. And on the y-axis, you've got the percentage of overweight adults. And what's striking is that for the states which are more progressive, which have had higher income growth, etc., over time you're beginning to see overweight and obesity levels rising relative to underweight. Whereas for states which continue to be low-income, lagging states, the issue of underweight continues to be. But there's a story here. The story here is as progress takes place, we are tripping from one set of nutrition problems to another set of nutrition problems. We're tripping from underweight and stunting to overweight and obesity. And we as the development community need to be as concerned about the overweight and obesity problems as we are about underweight and stunting problems. Because you don't want to go from one public health problem to another public health problem. And the public health problems around overweight and obesity, in terms of increased incidence of non-communicable diseases, heart diseases, diabetes, etc., are enormous. And that's a concern that I think the Indian policy community hasn't yet taken on as severely as it ought to. But one of the points that I make in much of my work and in my presentation is the solution to undernutrition and the solution to overnutrition is the same. The solution is the same in terms of better access to more nutritious food, better access to fresh fruit, vegetables, and food that's high in micronutrients. And I think once you get that right, and once the relative prices of these foods come down, then the chances that as incomes rise, you transition into cheaper processed foods which have high calorie density become smaller relative to a diet which has higher levels of micronutrient-rich food. And so that's the pressure that we are on, looking at how do we make that switch. Let me skip this because it's a similar story that I've talked about. But diet diversity becomes a really crucial part of the change that needs to take place. And if you look at diet diversity figures, you find that over time there's been significant improvement in the more progressive states, the states which have higher income levels, in terms of improved diet diversity, but it's still not at the level where you would see massive nutrition change for the very poor populations in these states. But if you look at the centers of the country, the areas from Rajasthan through Madhya Pradesh to Chhattisgarh, Orissa, etc., these parts of the country still have very limited diet diversity. And these parts of the country continue to be stuck in a staple grain-based diet. And unless you change that, we're not going to see big changes in nutrition. Now, one of the things that we've looked at is how cropping systems have been changing. And if you look at these two maps of India, you see the difference between 1960s and 2000. So what you see is that in the sort of Indo-Gangetic plain, the sort of rice-wheat belt of India, you see there's been a big drop in diversity. And these areas have become the rice and the wheat monoculture areas. And the diversity has actually dropped into the central part of the country. And so then you go in and look at what happened to diversity in the central part of the country, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, parts of Orissa, etc. What's happened is that you've switched from staple grains into cotton, soybean, oil seeds, etc. So even as you think about diversity and diversity change at the local level, at the district level, we need to be looking at what are the alternatives to a cotton-based production system, to a production system that enhances vegetable, fruit or livestock products, etc. It's not easy because the value chains are not there, but it's something that we need to think about from a policy point of view. Just to re-emphasize that point, look at what happened to pulses. And this figure shows you what happened to pulses area between the 60s to 2000. You find that the overall area in pulses in India dropped by 650,000 hectares. P.K. Joshi, I know, will talk a lot about pulses later today, and he may have some newer numbers on this. But there's been a dramatic drop in area in the pulses, and dramatic drop in overall productivity relative to the productivity of staple grains. And unless you turn that around, you're not going to see increased stability in supply of pulses and stability in prices of pulses. The same thing for fruits and vegetables. The area of fruits and vegetables has increased over time, but it's nowhere near the area that you would need in order to meet the demand that's growing with income growth. Milk and milk products is another interesting area. You see significant improvements in most parts of the country except in the lagging states of India. In the lagging states of India, which including Orissa, milk production hasn't kept up with demand. And that's primarily because much of the livestock that's used is used for draft power relative to using livestock for dairy production. When you look at the number of females to male cattle in a place like Punjab, you have more than 20 females to one male. But in many districts in Orissa, you probably have less than one female for every male in the cattle population. If that ratio doesn't turn around, you cannot promote the dairy system. Okay, so draft power, mechanization, and all that are related back to nutrition issues, and that's something we need to think about. So the food system, as we look at it, is a food system that's still very much a staple-based food system. We've seen increased consumption, but the increased consumption has still been cereal-based consumption and vegetable consumption. Livestock products are a small part of our overall diet today, even as incomes are rising. So one of the questions that comes to me constantly is, if you have this rising demand, then why is the supply not keeping up with it? As an economist, I've learned in my economics classes that as demand rises, supply keeps up, and therefore prices get equilibrated, etc. But there's a definite market failure when you look at what's happening in India. You don't see that supply response the way one would expect to see. And why is that the case? I think one of the primary reasons why we see this happening is because there's still a very strong policy bias in India for rice and wheat production relative to all other crops. I'm not saying it's not important to produce rice and wheat, but what I'm saying is one needs to look at it in terms of a balanced food system, and we need to look at it in terms of promoting other crops that are also needed within the food system. But right now, government policy at the state level, national level, is still very much focused on that green revolution mentality that we have. And at the same time, you don't have the market infrastructure developed, especially rural market infrastructure for perishable products, the skills needed for moving out of staple grains, and then the transactions costs small farmers have in trying to connect to these value chains. Lots of new supermarket value chains coming in, but smallholders just don't have access to those value chains. The costs of connecting into those chains are very, very high. So I've argued, and I have a series of papers that argue for what I call a crop-neutral agriculture policy. An agriculture policy that promotes overall agriculture growth without putting bets on one or two crops. And the way you do that is you essentially remove the current supports that you have on a few commodities, but at the same time invest in infrastructure, market development, etc. And also look at our food security policies, our food stock policies, in terms of trying to make them more balanced rather than staple grain focused policies. And that point comes to what happens to our food security system and what happens to much of the subsidized consumer subsidies for food that we give. And here, my latest piece that's come out talks about this bumpy road as India moves from food security to nutritional security. Because what we need to do is move away from subsidized food grains through the PDS system, through the midday meal systems, the Anganwadi system, to a way in which one can look at balance in diets and more provision of micronutrient-rich food within these public distribution systems, the food security systems, etc. And in that context, to look at both cash versus food as alternatives to address the safety net problem. It's a huge discussion around it, and it's not something we can go in detail today, but it's something that is worth bringing up for discussion. And one needs to look at how do you go beyond staple grains when we think about the need for food security. So, what I think we need to do is we need to think about redesigning our food policy and focusing it on nutrition security rather than the traditional focus that food policy has had on calorie security. And so the way we would do that is we would continue to focus on agriculture and agriculture productivity growth, but with a difference. The difference being looking at promoting diversity rather than promoting one or two staple crop monoculture systems. Then we certainly need to keep our focus on Eastern India, and there's a lot of renewed attention on Eastern India, including Orissa. But again, when we think about agriculture policy for Eastern India, we need to think about it in a crop neutral sense, rather than think about it in a staple crop sense. We need to look at ways in which we can connect smallholders to markets, to value chains, much better than we are today. And the transactions costs associated with connecting small farmers to markets are enormous, and we don't have good models for reducing those transactions costs. And that's an area where I think the development community can play a much bigger role than it's playing. Then as we look at safety net programs, we need to look at much better intersectoral, interdepartmental convergence on nutrition goals. I think the agriculture community looks at nutrition security from a calorie sufficiency angle, whereas much of the nutrition, the child welfare, women's welfare community looks at nutrition from a sanitation point of view, from a fortification point of view, from supplementation point of view, etc. But there's no great coalition and convergence of a common strategy across these departments. And the common strategy, I believe, would be on better access to more diversity and more micronutrient-rich food. And the last area, I think, which requires significant debate is to think about in-kind food transfer versus cash transfer programs. Not something that can be easily done, but it's something where the debate needs to start. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.